All right, we are gonna get started as I clear my throat and stop stalling. Welcome to Houston Oasis. We are a community of compassion and reason. We are an alternative to faith-based communities, and behind me, you can see our core values, including people are more important than beliefs. My name is Will, and I am gonna be your MC for today. This is a great lineup. We had a great lineup, but one of our people in the lineup is not here, and that's going to be our musician. So there's a small chance the musician will come in a little bit later. Until then, someone's bringing in a little portable piano. So Johnny Rhodes and I are going to do a song. We're going to do Ebony and Ivory. No. The keyboard's almost here. It's the last thing you want from us. So with all that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, which I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. Mr. Bart Campolo. He is a secular community builder, counselor, and writer who currently serves as the humanist chaplain at the University of Cincinnati. He also hosts a podcast called Humanize Me. He is the son of Tony Campolo, a prominent Christian evangelical pastor, and was a pastor himself before becoming a secular humanist, my favorite type of humanist. So with that introduction, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Mr. Bart Campolo.
Thank you for that sitting ovation. It's just a joke. I'm so glad to be here. Actually, what I should say is I'm so glad to be back here. It's funny, I've met a couple... Okay, what am I doing wrong? Oh, there you go. I've met a couple of old-timers, people that have been part of this community since the very beginning. How many of you were here in the early days? Oh, a significant number, okay. So I came here many years ago. I mean, I think it was like 6, 7, 8 years ago. And it was one of the highlights of my early secular life, because I was wondering, was there such a thing as a secular community where everybody wasn't just pissed off all the time? And I came here, and people were so nice. And I thought, this is what I'm looking for. And probably some of you are still here because this was what you were looking for. I'm sad to see, though, that you've stopped liking each other so much so that you want to sit very far apart. That's a COVID era thing, right? Is that it? You just guys still haven't gotten used to sitting close next to each other anymore. That's all right. That's all right. So are we good on the sound? Is it okay for everybody? Okay, we're good. All right, so here's the deal. When secular audiences that I go to talk to, when they find out that I'm the son of a famous evangelical preacher, and my dad is a famous evangelical preacher, who kind of traveled the world preaching the gospel and was Bill Clinton's personal pastor when he was in the White House and in trouble. When they find that out, and when they find out that I spent 30 years of my life as an evangelical inner city missionary and running around giving talks to youth groups and conventions all over the place in churches, when they figure that out, what they assume is that I'm going to tell the story of how I left Christianity, of my sort of deconversion story. And I'm not. And the reason I'm not is because most of those stories, they're all the same. Most of them are the same. You know, like somebody's like, yeah, I read a book and I figured out that this was all nonsense and I couldn't hold on to it anymore. You know, or I got really treated badly by Christians in this church because I was gay, or because I was a woman, or because I was married to the wrong person, and And when I left and didn't go every week, it stopped seeming important to me. You know, like the stories, there's a certain sameness to deconversion stories. And so instead, I never tell that story. What I usually do is I usually tell the story not of how I left Christianity, but of how I joined it in the first place. How as a teenager, I became a Christian. And the reason I tell the story of what drew me into Christianity was because what drew me into Christianity wasn't the Christian narrative. And I don't know how that could draw anybody in. You know, God loves you so much and he'll kill you forever if you don't accept it. You know, the reason I like to talk about how I got into how I got saved, if you will, is because it's a way of illustrating the attraction and the transformative power of a loving, purposeful community. That there's something incredibly compelling about a group of people that share the same values and that kind of have a set of tribal rituals and that are doing something that in a sense they feel like they're part of a movement that's bigger than themselves and that isn't just about them but it's about making things better for others. And again, the reason why I gave that talk a lot was because I would go to a lot of secular communities that hadn't figured out that just not believing in God isn't enough to build a community around. That at some point you have to figure out not what don't you believe, but what are you committed to? What is it? What holds you together? What's your reason for being a group? Because there's a huge need out there. There's tremendous numbers of people in our society who feel alienated, who feel alone, who don't have close friends, who don't have a sense of vision and purpose, who are depressed, who are anxious. Are you aware of the mental health crisis in our country? Because being a therapist, I'm so aware of it. People come into my office every day who think that they have mental health problems. And in an alarming number of cases, they don't have mental health problems. They're just lonely as hell and they need somebody to talk to. And they have to pay $125 an hour to get it because they haven't learned the skills, because they're not comfortable enough in groups of people, but mainly because nobody's engineered a social setting where a socially awkward person can make friends. It's really hard to make friends. It's funny, I heard a couple walking in here said they had moved here from Seattle. Where are you, Seattle people? You're moving to Seattle. Come talk to me afterwards. Because one of the other most loving secular communities I know is in Seattle. Yeah, and I'll introduce you to the nicest people you're ever going to meet there. But when people move to a new city, it's a crisis for a lot of us. Where am I going to make friends? How am I going to find people that share my values? Where am I going to find people that will accept me? And in my church days, it was easy. You just looked for the Presbyterian church, and if you didn't like that one, you went around the corner to the Baptist church. Like somewhere they would find nice people. And they were always happy to have you. But if you're a secular person, if you're somebody who's committed to love as a lifestyle without any supernatural trappings, it can be very hard. And so oftentimes I talk to people about the need for secular communities, but it seems stupid to come here and talk to you guys about the need for a secular community. You figured that out. Last night I was hanging out with Jacob and some of your gang at some German hot dog restaurant. My wife told me when I was going on this trip, she said, be sure you eat something green. And I don't think there was anything green within 50 yards of that place. But as I talked to people last night, the more I talked with members of your community, the more it occurred to me that what you folks and I have most in common, probably most of you, we're in Houston, all of you. The thing that we have in common is the persistent need to explain ourselves to Christian friends and Christian family members who are trying to understand how we could possibly live without God. Can anybody relate to that? Does anybody come from a background where you have to explain yourself? Can I get a witness? And you might say, oh, no, I don't have any friends like that, but like my Uber driver, like the lady at the drugstore, the political campaigners that come to my door. So many people in a community like this are faith-based. So many people are doing that. And so many of them are distraught by the way we're living our lives. You say, how could they be distraught? Like, we're such nice people. But they are. And the more committed they are to the faith, especially the evangelical ones, the more worried they are that if we don't change our minds, what? We'll burn in hell forever. But even the ones that aren't worried about us burning in hell, they're worried about us being alone. They're worried about us not being moral. They're worried about us not having a moral compass. Sometimes it's our parents. Sometimes it's our kids. Sometimes it's our neighbor. Sometimes it's somebody at work. And so, as I was talking to those people last night, I decided to change what I was going to talk about a little bit. Now, in the old days, in my old preacher days, I would have said that the Holy Spirit gave me a word. But either way, I just changed my mind. But either way, it means that this talk I'm going to give you, it may not be polished as the other one, but it'll be fresh. It'll be dynamic because I'm into it. So a number of years ago, when I first came out of the faith, and it was a big deal in Christendom because my dad was a big deal, and to be honest with you, I was kind of a big deal for a little while there in Christendom. And so when I left the faith and people found out about it, they wrote newspaper articles and magazine things. I ended up getting written up in the New York Times, and everyone was, my 5 seconds of fame. And this guy came and did a documentary film. And he said, I want to document you and your father talking to each other because my father had a really hard time with my deconversion. And what had happened was that my father and I were working stuff out, and my friend said, hey, could I just come and set up a camera and watch you guys talk to each other for a while? And he ended up making a documentary film about it. I think it was called Leaving My Father's Faith. And from that point on, as soon as that documentary got released, I started hearing from people all over the country who were like, how do you still have a relationship with your father where you can talk openly about stuff like that? Where he asks you questions about what you believe, and you listen to him talk about what he believes, and it's not hostile. How do you do that? I ended up starting a podcast called Humanize Me, which was kind of about how to make sense of life, how to make the most of life on the other side of faith. And I got even more emails from people. And they would always say the same thing. They would always say, I wish I had heard you before I told my family that I wasn't a Christian anymore. Because we made a hash of it, and we still haven't dug out. And so in the end, I sort of figured out, what might be a good thing for us to know, might be especially a good thing for you to know, because even if you've been out of it for 20 years, or maybe you were never even in it, but even if it's not an issue for you anymore, there are going to be people that are going to come to Oasis over and over again who are fresh. And the question is how do you equip those people? How do you equip people to be genuine ambassadors of humanist goodness in the world? How do we relate to those people in a way that isn't toxic? And so literally, I sat up last night after I got home from the I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep after eating that food. But I sat up and I've got 7 ideas for you, okay? And I'm just going to run them through them really fast. Now, my understanding is that if somebody comes up here and they lay out some cool ideas for you, then we take a break and then people are allowed to ask questions, right? Okay. I feel good about this then. So the first thing I would say to you about dealing with, especially, did any of you grow up in the faith? Did any of you grow up as part of the faith? Okay, so this is for you. The first and most crucial thing to do when you are encountering a Christian who wants to talk to you about faith is, if you get nothing else out of this would be my best advice is, start off by telling them all the stuff you learned in church that you still appreciate and that you're still grateful for. Start out by telling them the values that you learned in church and the experiences that you had in church and the skills that you gained in church and the role models that you met in church, all the good stuff. Any good thing that happened to you, and you say, Bart, you don't understand. I got knocked around. They messed with my sexuality. They filled my head with fear. I still am struggling with like post-religious trauma. And like I got nothing but anger and pain. And I know, but underneath all that, somewhere, something good happened to you. I'm not saying the narrative made any sense, but there was a Sunday school teacher who was nice to you. Or the music inspired you. Or you learned to cook on a retreat in the kitchen with the other leaders. Like somewhere, somehow, there must have been something good that happened there. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't give forgiveness. I learned about forgiveness in church. Now, don't get me wrong. Christianity didn't invent forgiveness. There's a tremendous, natural case to be made for forgiveness. Like elephants forgive. Wolves forgive, right? Like any social animal knows that there's going to be conflict within the tribe, and if you can't resolve the conflict, the tribe will fall apart and you'll all die. Forgiveness is just a really good idea. There's lots of great stuff about forgiveness, and the truth is you can learn forgiveness in 97 other places, but I didn't. I learned about it in church. You said, but it's not specific to church. That's true. You know what's funny is I'm loyal to Philadelphia. I root for Philadelphia sports teams. You said, but they're not better than other teams. Why don't you root for the Texans? Because I grew up in Philadelphia. And you go but there's nothing intrinsically better. I know. It's just where I learned. I learned to like sports in Philadelphia, so those are my teams. That's how I am about Christianity. I don't believe in Christianity. I don't go to church. I'm not a Christian in any way, shape, or form. There's not a supernatural believing bone in my body. But I still speak with that accent. Does that make any sense? Any of you that grew up in church, you're just watching me walk around and you're going some of you are triggered right now. You're going oh my God, he reminds me of every youth pastor I ever met. Because that's what I was, right? You go people say oh, the Lord has given me a great love for kids, and God just laid on my heart. Forget the Lord. I love kids. If I hadn't been a youth pastor at a church, I would have been a youth pastor at a mosque. If I was born in Afghanistan, I'm a kid guy. It wasn't Christianity that made me that way, but that's where it found expression. That's where I learned it. You say, well, why would you want to emphasize that to your Christian friends? Because the rest of it's going to be hard for them. It's going to be easy for you to define the things that are different. And so you start out by defining the things that you're grateful for, the places that you have common ground. Because what you're essentially saying is, I see value in what you do. I see value in the community that you're a part of. And anybody that's ever traveled around the world knows that if you can't find and articulate what you value about the culture that you're in, you're not going to do very well with those people. So the first thing you do is that. Second thing you do is that at whatever point you have to talk about, like, well, if it's so great, why did you leave it? I think the most important thing I could say is that don't tell them why you're not a Christian, or why you're not a Muslim, or why you're not whatever they are. Don't give them your reasons. Don't tell them what's wrong with their faith, or why their story makes no sense, or what the evidence says, for two reasons. Number one is, they already know. I mean, some of you grew up in church, so you know this. Like, there isn't a Christian alive that hasn't gone like, this story doesn't make any sense. Or I don't know is the Bible really true? Or is there really a God? I mean, like, really, the doubts that took you out of Christianity, did you leave Christianity the moment that doubt at first occurred to you, or did you live with it for 20 years? Most of us struggled. So, like, you're not going to be telling anybody anything new. What you're going to be telling them is, I'm here to get you. And so what I would encourage you to do is not to list your reasons, but to tell your story. Just tell the story of how it happened to you. In therapy, we always tell people, in a conflict, use I statements. Have you ever heard somebody say, use I statements? And what that means is, instead of saying, like, I hate it, you always interrupt me. And you never listen to me. That's one way you could say it. Or you could say, you know what? Sometimes I feel unheard. And I feel like I can't communicate in a way that gets across to you. And you go, like, you're saying the same thing. And I go, like, I know, but when I accuse you of not listening, people go, oh, and they get defensive. But when I say, this is my story, nobody goes like, nobody can, that first thing is like, it doesn't make you defensive. The second thing is nobody can argue with you. I mean, you say like, I feel sad. No, you don't. Right? Your emotions are your story is yours, and no one can. And so if you want to avoid an argument at Thanksgiving with your family, don't give your reasons that you don't believe in Christianity. Just tell the story of how it happened to you. I was doing this, and then this happened. And I read this book, and it didn't make sense to me. If there's one gift I have to give to you today, there's one thing that like brought me all the way from Cincinnati, I want to give you one word. The one word that has been the most helpful to me in forging healthy relationships with the Christians that are around me. And that word is can't. I never tell Christians why I don't believe in God, or why I won't believe in God, or why I'm glad I don't believe in God. I always tell them why I can't believe in God. I'm not able to. I lost the ability. You see, but that makes it sound weak. And they go, no, it makes it sound impossible, which is what it is. So I say to my dad, not, I won't believe in that. I reject your God. I renounce your God. I just go, there came a point in my life, Dad, where I couldn't make it work anymore. I tried so hard to stay a Christian because I liked being part of the church, and I had a job, and I had friends, and I had an identity there. And so like when I say I can't believe in God, you got to believe me. I had nothing to gain and everything to lose. But I couldn't do it. And I still can't. And invariably, they'll say to you, I don't see why. And then you say, but aren't there things that you can't believe? Like, you don't believe in Islam, do you? And I said, if I put a gun to your head and said, I'm going to kill your whole family, and you're going to lose everything unless you can pass a lie detector test that says that you believe that Muhammad flew from Mecca to Medina on a flying horse in one night, I said, could you pass the test? And they'll look you right in the eye and say, what? Oh, no, I can't believe that. And I said, so you know what it's like to be unable to believe in somebody else's God? That's what it's like for me. I can't. The evidence you find so compelling isn't compelling to me. It doesn't work for me. I'm really into confessional arguing. I can't. I'm sorry. And sometimes what I think is one of the most important things you can do in relation to your believing friends and family members is to share with them the ways in which your secular humanism doesn't work for you. I mean, every worldview has a problem, right? There's some things that you haven't worked out yet, right? People say, what do you mean? I said, well, for me, when I was in Christianity, one of the things I loved about Christianity was there's an ironclad case for the infinite value of every human being. Everybody was important because everybody was what? Child of God, right? I want to believe that everybody's important. I want to believe in human equality, but it's really hard for me. I lived in some of the hardest inner city ghettos in the world, and I've met some people that don't seem as valuable as some of the other people I know. That seem inferior. Seem like they don't think right. Like they don't care about things. Like they're hard to deal with. And I don't like that. It's a struggle for me. And I go why is it that I know I'm supposed to think that they're important, but I don't. And I don't have an ironclad argument. I don't have a way back. I'm still working on that. I'm still reading books. You go so you haven't worked out your whole humanism yet? No, I really haven't. One of the things that's hardest for me coming out is that I knew how to pursue goodness as a way of life and love as a way of life as a Christian. And when I first left the faith, I didn't know how to do it. What do you do? I used to love people by bringing them to church. Where do I bring them now? I used to love people by sharing the gospel with them. Do I have anything to say to them now? Do I have any good news for somebody? If a kid's a drug addict on the corner of my neighborhood, can I go to him and say, listen, buddy, I've got a better way of life to offer you? And he says, well, what is that better way? How do I articulate? It was a hard thing for me. I hadn't worked it out yet. And you know one of the most effective things for me to say to my Christian friends was? I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. What do you think I should do? What do you think a person should do if they're really committed to loving values and they can't believe in God? How do you think that person should live? And they say, well, you should just accept Jesus Christ. No, I can't do that. What if I can't do that? What do you think Jesus would want me to do? It's a very effective question. So I'm making it their problem. See, at first I was their problem. But now I'm not their problem. I'm coming to them for help. What do you think I should do? Do you think Jesus would rather me join a motorcycle gang, or do you think he would rather me join a community like Oasis? What do you think? And I think Jesus would rather you be with nice people. And do you think Jesus would want me to volunteer at the local food bank, or do you think he would want me to produce child pornography? Jesus would much rather you be at the food bank. And you're okay, so, and all of a sudden they're trying to figure out what does Jesus want a person like you or I to do? And that's a very good place for them to be. Heck, I don't just ask for their advice. I ask them to pray for me. I know secular humanists who get very irritated when their family says, we're praying for you, Joey. And they go fuck you. I ask Christians to pray for me. I ask them to pray for me in very specific. First of all, I ask them to pray for me because and I take it as a compliment when they say they are praying for me, because honestly, that's their language of love. When they're saying, what they're really saying is, I care about you. I want the best for you. And I take it that way. I say, yeah, I want you to pray for me. And they say, well, I'm praying that God would give you faith. I go, that's a really good idea. I always encourage my Christian friends, rather than talking to me about my lack of faith, you should talk to God. Because the Bible teaches that we are saved by grace through faith. And this not of yourself, lest any man should boast. It is the gift of God. My Aunt Rose was great at this. My Aunt Rose said, "Oh, Bart." She was mortified by my leaving the faith. She said, "Oh, Bart." She said, "I pray for you every night. I'm not going to talk to you because, it's not your fault. God's the one who gives faith, and I talk to him every night and say, give that boy some faith." I say, "Thank you, Aunt Rose. Keep talking to God and don't talk to me." But more than that, I ask them, I say to them, "You trust God, don't you?" And they all say, "Yes, I trust God." And I said, "Will you trust God with my destiny? You keep telling me that God is loving and kind, and it's not his will that anyone should burn in hell. It's not his will should anyone should perish." I said, "Will you trust God with my destiny? Will you, because you believe in a God who is able to do abundantly more than we could ever hope or ask or expect." And you say, "Wait a second, you don't quote scripture to Christians." Of course I do. That's the language that they understand. And there's lots of stuff in their Bible that would suggest that God saves everybody, not just Christians. That's a very specific interpretation of the Bible. But there's a wonderful verse in 1 Timothy. That says, and we have put our faith in the living God who is the Savior of all men, and especially those who believe. Not only those who believe, especially those who believe. You say, "You quote scripture to Christians?" Of course I do. That's their language. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give them a Christian way of believing that I might not be going to go to hell after all. Because you would be surprised if you can relieve a Christian of their fear of your eternal damnation, oftentimes they'll let up. They're stuck with trying to convert you. If their thing was true, it would be unkind and horrible if they didn't try to convert you. As a matter of fact, if you have evangelical friends and family members that are not actively trying to convert you, they don't like you. The thing you have to remember is that leaving the faith is, for them, your leaving the faith feels like a huge attack. It feels like a huge judgment. You're basically saying, this thing that is the center of your life, the thing that's the most important to you, that you think makes you a good and moral person, I don't need it. Which is another way of saying what? I'm better than you. And that hurts. It hurts when somebody judges you that way. What they see, what they're sort of thinking is like, you think you don't need the thing that I absolutely depend upon. And that makes them want to cut you down to size and show you that there are problems with you. And so, what I find myself doing is it's much easier to talk to somebody if you recognize that they think you're scary. And you may not feel scary, but just sitting here today, you're a terrifying challenge. You're a terrifying rebuke to anybody who says that a person can't live a meaningful life without God. Apart from me, the Bible says you can do nothing. Every day that you raise your kids, every day that you're a good worker, every day that you're kind, every time that you sacrifice for somebody else, every time you do a good deed or give money to a charity or build a new friendship or reach out to a lonely person and care for them, you're doing something. And that's scary. And it's good to remember that you're scary because it'll make you nicer. And I want you to be nicer. Because there's a lot of secular people out there that have given us a very bad name. Not because they're not intelligent, not because they're not rational, not because they don't have great arguments, but because they're not very kind. Because they've forgotten something. And this is the fifth and maybe the most important thing I'll have to say to you is, you want to do well with non-Christians? figure out why you're there in the first place. Why are you even in this conversation? What are you trying to do? Like, it's Thanksgiving and you're at the table and somebody pulls you into it. You're at work and somebody says something about their church and say, where do you go to church? And you're pulled into it. And the question I have for you is like, what are you trying to do? When you respond to that question, what are you trying to do? And what I would say is, you should figure out and be sure it's about love or neighborliness or civility and not about winning. A lot of times in our conversations, we're trying to win the conversation. And what I would suggest is that if you're trying to win a conversation with a believer, you must not be very secure in your unbelief. Because if you know that you're all right, then you're free to do something different in that conversation, to try to understand, to try to encourage, to try to connect. You're free to try to be a blessing in the life of somebody who's caught in a very difficult worldview. A worldview that's crumbling, a worldview that's losing currency, a worldview that you and I both know haunts even the people who believe in it. A worldview that makes them afraid that they're not good enough. A worldview that tells them that they don't belong, that they're worthy of damnation. It's a tough place that they're in. And so you should, if you have any compassion at all, you should want to connect. You should want to encourage. You should want to understand. Here's my question. In your relationships with believers, what's a win for you? Like, you have this conversation, when you walk away from it, what's a win? What does it look like? Is it a win if that person's feeling bad? Is it a win if you've shown them that you're smarter than them? Or is it a win if they say, wow, I really felt listened to. Wow, that secular person, there's an authenticity about them. Wow, they were really open with me. Is it a win when they feel like they've made a friend? So, gosh, that's not always the conversation I've had. Okay, don't worry. There are new chances coming this week. And there's always that opportunity. And you say, well, but what if they don't engage me on that level? Then you engage them. You say, wait, you want to have these conversations with me? Yeah. Yeah, because these conversations with people are what make the world a safer place and a more civil society. You want to actually, you go, so you might go, you don't actually say to somebody, hey, you go to church, right? Knowing that they do. Yeah. How's that work? What do you like about your church? What's going, and you're like, but you just know they're going to ask you, where do you go to church? And you're going to say that. Yeah, I want to be in that conversation. Because it's an opportunity to make the world a better place. And it's an opportunity to plant a little flag in a Christian heart that says, there's a way to be secular that doesn't mean you have to give up being loving. And sometimes that's the only thing that keeps people in the game, is because they're afraid that if they leave, they won't ever find fellowship with loving people again. Because that's what they told me. They told me that if I left the faith, I would have no reason to be moral, I would have no fellowship, I would be alone in a world, I would become a bad person, and I didn't want to become a bad person. So every time you engage somebody in a conversation in which you demonstrate care and understanding and love, you make it more possible for that person to think their way out the way you did. Last thing I'll say is this stuff works really good in one-on-one conversations. Doesn't work so well in a group, does it? Thanksgiving table, somebody goads you at the table, says something, and you're stuck. Has anyone ever been in that situation where like you're in a group and somebody sort of backs you down or tries to goad you into it in talking about it? Like, what do you do? And I'll tell you what I do in a group when somebody says something like, "That's what I love about Trump. I love that he just, he's just for the church." And I used to argue, and I don't. You know what I do now? This is my second gem for you. The first is can't. The second is, wow. It works better if you're bald. Some of you bald people. What I do in a group setting when somebody says something ridiculous, I just slap my forehead and I go, wow, I think differently about that. I just go, wow, I see that very differently. And of course, as soon as you do that, you instantly become the most interesting person in the room. Everybody turns and looks at you and says, and then usually the person that just said the terrible thing says, "Oh yeah? What do you think?" And then I go like, I actually don't think this is the right setting for that kind of conversation. But I'll tell you what, if you really want to find, like, I'd be glad to talk to you about this. Maybe we should have lunch sometime next week, or you want to go for a walk, or like we could talk. Guess what? 9 times out of 10, what? That person doesn't really want to know what you think. They just wanted to make a statement that would make you uncomfortable. And you're sitting there, and sometimes we don't say anything because we don't want to blow up Thanksgiving dinner, and then we feel like we sold out, or like we're weak, and that's why, like, I'm going to go on the record. Wow, I see that differently. And then I'm not going to fight it out in front of people. Because people who want to argue with you when there's more than one person around, they don't want to argue. They don't want to figure things out. They don't want to understand. They don't want to connect. They want to perform. And I'm not interested in argument as a performance sport. So one-on-one, I seek to connect and I seek to engage. In a group, I just seek to stake out the line and go like, I'm not with you on this. And I don't want to fight, and I don't think this is the place to talk about it. The last thing I'll tell you, I can't tell many people this, but this is where I'll end. The last thing I'd say is when you're talking to secular people, don't tell them what you believe, tell them your story. For you guys, you're really lucky. You know where your story ends? It ends with, and then I found a group of people that I felt like I could connect with. And we get together, and we talk about how to be a better person, how to be more compassionate, how to appreciate this life more. We listen to talks about science because we think this life is so precious, and we listen to talks about science because it just makes us think it's more awesome that we got to be alive in the first place. You tell them about your group. You tell them about somebody who was lonely, who came to your group and found friendship. I met a guy last night who met his wife at Oasis. You tell them, like, people meet each other. We have a shared value system. I'm 26 years old, and I got friends who are 60 and 70. Like, it's an intergenerational community. Where else do you get to do that? Tell them about your group. That's what I do. When I first became secular, I'll just tell you one story and I'm done. When I first became secular, I was living in an inner city neighborhood in Cincinnati. And I was deconverting, and so were a bunch of my fellow Christian missionary buddies. We were all sort of on our way out. But we had a group in our neighborhood that had dinner together every Sunday, every Tuesday night. It was us do-gooders, us kind of do-gooders in the neighborhood. And there was a bunch of ghetto people that I had gotten to know at this local soup kitchen. People that were really struggling. And it was a beautiful thing. Like, we'd eat dinner together, we became friends. And, when you're friends with poor people, you end up doing you clean bed bugs out of houses, you do literacy stuff, you visit people in jail, because those are your neighbors. And I was part of this group, and there was this homeless guy in the group named Danny. Danny was about 40 years old, and I got to know him when he was in a beef with somebody else in our community. I got to know Danny like he was 50 years old. He'd been in and out of prison all of his life. He'd been kicked out of his house when he was 14 years old, lived on the streets. He's a drug addict. He's been shot 3 times, been stabbed 5. I mean, like, he wasn't going to be okay. You know what I mean? Like, he wasn't ever going to be okay. But he was a sweet guy. And he had dinner with us every Tuesday night, and I really liked him. And every few months, I would say to him, hey, Danny, there's this apartment in the neighborhood. It does low-income housing. Like, I can fill out the paperwork for you, and you can get in there. It'll cost you $25 a month. It's totally federally subsidized. Get you off the street. You go, man, I can't handle that sort of thing. I can't handle that responsibility. It's like, it's $25 a month. Like, you spend more than that on beer in a week. If you can't make it, I'll pay it. Like, I just want you off the street. Because, if you're friends with somebody, if you're really friends with somebody and they're homeless, sometimes in the middle of the night on a cold night, it's weird. It's hard to feel good in your warm house with your warm food when you know your friend's like a half mile away under a bridge. So, honestly, I didn't want him off the streets for him. I kind of wanted him off the streets for me. But he wouldn't do it. Then one Tuesday night, we were at a dinner like this. And I was the person in the group that was supposed to give the talk that night, the little 10-minute word of secular inspiration. And I hadn't believed in God for years by then. But I was telling the story about how what people say, like, you guys have this thing, right? Like, what you believe isn't as important as what? People are more important than beliefs. Yeah, I believe that, but like, people are made up of beliefs. People are made up of their beliefs. Ideas matter for people, right? Ideas affect the way they. And what I was saying is, like, people will tell you they believe one thing, and the way they live tells you they believe another. They'll tell you they're all about social justice, but then, like, the way they live, maybe not so much. Or they'll tell you that they're an evangelical Christian and they think you're going to hell, but then, like, when you hang out with them, they just want to talk about football. And if they really thought you were going to burn in hell, like, really? You wouldn't say something? It's like, maybe they don't really believe I'm going to hell after all, right? So I was doing this, and I ended up telling this story, the story of Blondin the tightrope walker. Any of you know the story of Blondin the tightrope walker? Do you know who Blondin was? Charles Blondin? You do. Yeah, Blondin was his name. Yeah. So Charles Blondin, around the turn of the century, the last century, like the old time century, Charles Blondin was a great tightrope walker, an acrobat. And one day, in the middle of the night, Blondin strung a tightrope across the Niagara Falls. Now people had tried this before, and it was illegal to do it because people just kept dying. I mean, this was kind of this is before there was the guy on the World Trade Center. Blondin was this was the great white whale of tightrope walking. And so in the middle of the night, he strung it. And by the time the sun came up, Blondin was out there on the pole, walking across Niagara Falls. And the word went out on both sides. Blondin's on the tightrope. And huge crowds gathered around to watch. And Blondin edged his way across the tightrope. And a couple of times, just for fun, he stopped and sat on the tightrope, laid down on the tightrope, freaked people out. And as he made his way finally from the American side to the Canadian side, when he got to the Canadian side, the last few steps, the crowd became incredibly quiet, like, is he going to make it? And when Blondin took his last step onto the dry earth, the crowd burst into cheers. And they were all cheering, and Blondin was basking in the adulation of thousands of people cheering. And then they started cheering his name. They started going, Blondin, Blondin, Blondin. And with a great dramatic flourish, Blondin raised up his hands and he silenced the crowd. And you can imagine, like, what a great moment that would be for somebody. Like, wouldn't you love to have people cheering your name like that? I mean, just once in my life, I wish I would be in front of a crowd of people and they would start cheering, Bart, Bart, Bart. Wouldn't you like that? What's your name? Ted. Do you want to just give Ted a little thrill, just for a moment here? Will you go with me on this? Just go with me. Okay, ready? Start soft. Ted, Ted, Ted. Louder. Ted, Ted. Really loud. Ted, 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 Ted. Did you like it? Yeah. Blondin silenced the crowd. And he said, I am Blondin. Which seems funny, like they were all chanting your name. They know you're Blondin. He said, I am Blondin. Do you believe in me? And the crowd chanted, we believe, we believe, we believe. He silenced them again. He said, do you believe I can walk back across the tightrope? And the crowd said, we believe, we believe. He said, do you believe I can walk back across the tightrope with a man perched on my shoulders? And they said, we believe, we believe, we believe. He said, which one of you will be that man? And the crowd fell silent. And out of the crowd of thousands, one man stepped forward and climbed on Blondin's shoulders. And it was his business manager, who figured, like, this whole thing's going south if I don't do this. And for the next 3.5 hours, Blondin inched his way back across the tightrope with the man on his shoulders. And the point of the story is clear, right? How many people said they believed? How many really believed? One. Because to believe, to truly believe in something or someone is more than just to say, I think that's true. It's to base your life on it. It's to rest your life on it. Guess where I learned that good story? Yeah, in church. Yeah, you know I did, baby. But it works. It works for politics. It works for love as a way of life. It works for evolution. Like people who really believe in something live as though the thing they believe is true. So we were at this dinner this night, and Danny's there, right? And I'm telling the story, and there's like 50 or 60 of us there. And when I do that, when I did the same thing, where I was like, "Hey, has anyone ever?" And I looked at Danny. I said, "Hey, Danny, has anybody ever chanted your name?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Hey, let's just give Danny a thrill." And so same thing. I got the crowd, Danny, 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 and Danny's face lit up. And everybody was watching him, and he started to get. He was really into it. And they started chanting louder, Danny, Danny. And Danny stood up. And he turned to the crowd, and he closed his eyes, and he held his arms out. And they were like, Danny, Danny, Danny. And he's just drinking it in. And he sat down. And I said, how did it feel? He said, that felt great. All his friends chanting his name. He came up to me after the dinner, cleaning up, and he said, Bart, he said, nothing like that's ever happened to me in my life. He said, I've never had anybody look at me that way, talk. I never been there. He said, I felt something. He said, you know that apartment? He said, I come by the house tomorrow. You take me up there and we sign up for it? You see what happened, right? He was surrounded by a group of his friends. And he felt loved by them. He felt connected to them. There's no God. There's no God in the room. It's just him and his community. And I took him the next morning and we got him in that place, and he lived there for the last 15 years of his life. No, it wasn't 15 years. It was the last 7 years. I knew him for 15. Last 7 years of his life he lived there. He died a few years ago. And every time I saw him, from that day to the day he died, he would say to me, man, he said, that was something. He said, that night, that was something, man. Being part of that group really changed my life. I like to tell that story about my group, because that was just a group of people who hadn't worked out their humanism very well yet. There weren't that many of us. We didn't have cool songs yet. We didn't have rituals, but that group of people changed that guy's life. And that's something that only groups of people can do. There are some people that you can't fix, but you can surround in a way that makes a difference. And you're part of such a group. And so when you're talking to people of faith, don't just talk about what you believe or what you don't believe. Talk about your story and make sure that your story ends with. And one of the most hopeful things in my life is, I've discovered that I'm not alone. I hope that's helpful. I hope that's helpful, because that's all I'm aiming to be. This is a world full of people out there that are scared of us. And I think it would be a much better world if they started to see that our values aren't so different from theirs. And our communities have the potential to be just as transformative as theirs. That really, we're just human like they are, after all. Thanks so much. It's funny, on my podcast, we do some episodes that are Q and R, we call them, Q and response, because the absurdity of thinking I haven't answered anything. So yeah, if you got a question, I'm glad to respond. Go.
Yes, you raised many good points today, articulated some things that many of us have thought about speaking about religion with people. Do you have these written down? Because they were so good, I'd like to actually look back at a list of them if you got them written down somewhere.
No. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I'll tell you, that's a good lead into a little bit of my story. When I first left the faith, I was trying to figure out, like, you know, you're an ex-minister, you know, a preacher, like, what do you do? Like, I was trying to figure out, like, what do I do? And I spent a few years sort of knocking around trying to figure out what I did until I came across a book by a guy named Greg Epstein, who was the humanist chaplain at Harvard. And the book was called Good Without God. And I read it, and the stuff he wrote made some sense to me, but the thing that was most exciting to me was he described the humanist chaplaincy at Harvard, like this group that he had on the campus. And I was telling my wife about it. She said, you should go out there and check that out. So I called him up and I said, hey, can I come look at your group? And he said, sure. I went out there one weekend and I walked into the humanist chaplaincy at Harvard and they had like, you know, it's like 50 college students there. And I walked in and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like every youth group I ever ran. Just a bunch of nice kids, and they were like, you know, laughing and joking, and they were planning to go on a trip to some prison that they were going to go do something good at, and they had a book group where it's funny. Their book group was, they called it Harry Potter as Sacred Text. And what they did was they didn't believe in the Bible or any other sacred text, but they thought, like, the cool thing about the Bible is a bunch of Christians get together and they read a little passage of it and they go like, huh, what do you think that means? And they go like, how could we use that idea to live better lives? And they said, you know, we don't miss believing in a crazy narrative or a God, but we miss sitting around talking about how to be better people. So they started taking passages of Harry Potter, a book they all knew, and they would read the passage and they would go like, what does this passage say about friendship? And have any of us ever experienced that? Like, what does this mean to you? And then they would go like, yeah, you know, like Ron was really loyal to Harry in that. Like, you know, are there any situations where is there anyone that you feel like you've been disloyal to? And how could we address? And it was just like a youth group. And I walked around, I talked to these students at Harvard, and they were doing all stuff, and I thought to myself, I could do this. Like, I know how to run a youth group. And so I talked to Greg, and I said, this is great. He said, yeah. He said, you could do this. And he said, I got a friend in LA who's the Dean of Religious Life at University of Southern California. And he said, he's been looking for a humanist chaplain. I'll call him up. And both my kids lived in LA at the time, so I was like, yeah, that's great. So my wife and I moved to LA, and for 3 years I was the humanist chaplain at USC. And what I found is that it was really easy on a college campus. I mean, literally, all I would do was I would put out a sign that said, are you a humanist? On the main green. Kids would walk by and go like, what's a humanist? And I was like, well, you know, it means different things to different people. To our little group, what it means is that you want to pursue loving relationships, you want to make things better for other people, and you want to cultivate gratitude and wonder for just the privilege of being alive. You want to study life so that you can just be more wowed by it. And we've got a lot of data and research suggests that people that do those things end up feeling better about their lives and end up sort of thriving more. And so if you want to do all those, for us, being a humanist means that you do all those things and you don't believe in any kind of supernaturalism. And kids would say, well, I want to do all those things, and I don't believe in God. Could I join? And you're like, yeah, sure, we have dinner every Sunday night. And so like, so we built this group. And what I found was humanist evangelism was so easy. You build a loving group, and then you meet people that are lonely, and you say to them, hey, you should come join my group. And they come to your group, and everybody's nice to them, and they feel totally welcome, and you're talking about really good stuff like loving relationships and wonder and stuff like that. And they're going, this is great. And then invariably they would say, this is great. What do I got to believe to get in? See, when I did Christian evangelism, it sucked because you'd go like, they would fall in love with the group, and then they would say, what do I have to believe to get in? And you're like, well, you actually have to believe quite a lot of stuff, and a lot of it's pretty hard to believe. And they would still do it. That's how much they wanted to be in the group. At USC, so you don't have to believe anything, you just have to value these things that we value. And so the group grew and grew and grew and grew. And you say, why aren't you still there? And the answer is really simple. I couldn't raise enough money to do it. Like, there were Christian pastors on the campus, and their churches gathered up money and paid for them because they were like, go influence young people for Jesus. And there were Muslim imams on the campus, and the Muslim community was like, go influence people for Islam. And there were Buddhists, and I mean, they had everything at USC. And half the campus didn't believe in any God. I was the only person there providing pastoral care for secular students. I couldn't raise enough money because there's no infrastructure. You say, well, why don't I write it down? Because it would take time to write it down, and I got to earn a living, and nobody's going to pay me, and I can't sell it in the humanist bookstore because there isn't one, and I can't go on the humanist speaking circuit because this is it. Like there's just like there's you know like we're a long way away from having the kind of infrastructure and the kind of rituals and the kind of sacrificial support that it would take. It's a shame because on those college campuses there are all these really bright, wonderful young people who are going to change the world, and everybody else is trying to win them over. And I wasn't, don't get me wrong, I never tried to get the Christian kids to give up Christianity or the Muslim kids to give Islam. I just tried to get the secular kids to give up meaninglessness. I just tried to convince them that there was more to life than making rich people richer. That they could transform other people's lives simply by banding together and learning how to be good lovers.
But we have,
And so the reason why I don't write stuff down, like the podcast is all I can do. Like, because it's you know, and you go like, well, you must make millions on that podcast. I make tens. You know, like literally, there's a group of people that support the podcast, and it's just enough money for us to pay the editor and to pay for the website and to keep the thing going. Like, you know, there's no money in that. There's no money in being a secular evangelist, if you will, selling the good news that life can be more meaningful. There's going to be someday. There's going to be someday. Someday people are going to figure it out.
all right, we have a question
Go
right
for it.
here.
I think I know part of the answer
Yeah.
because it really, and also when you were speaking earlier and giving how to have the conversation.
Yeah.
How somebody's going to respond to that depends on what denomination they are and how deep into it they are in. I grew up in Southern Baptist.
My sister, yes, you speak the truth.
Yeah. I grew up in Southern Baptist. My mom was the daughter of a small town Southern Baptist preacher.
Yeah.
And they were so over the top, that when my grandma went to visit my uncle in Alaska, they had to talk her into wearing pants to go on an icy river. She thought playing cards was a sin. And I didn't think dancing was a sin, and my mom she didn't want to do to us what was done. They were abusive.
Yeah.
They were legitimately abusive.
Yeah.
But she didn't want to do that to us, so she let me take dance. But I didn't want to upset my grandparents, so I hid my dance pictures when they came.
Yeah.
So it really depends on how deep they are. But because I had to be really, really sick not to go to church, and this was all of my entire childhood. And we learned that Bible back and forth, and I heard it so many times. But I also heard in church all of the arguments, all of the justifications. The brainwashing and the gaslighting is so insidious.
Yeah, you really went through
They
it.
have a comeback for every single thing you said. Most of them, if they're in the Baptist church and they're deep. And they really read the Bible and they're really, that deep in it. But if they're kind of on the surface, and I visited some churches, and I'm like, these people don't know the Bible. They don't know. And I was like, they're underserving their, back when I was in it, they're underserving people.
If I can respond to you just a little bit, because of the podcast,
Yeah.
I have lots of people that come and they end up engaging me in like long distance coaching, like on Zoom. And so many of them say exactly what you're saying, that they've come from places that are so deep, and they've been traumatized in ways that are so much that they're like, the kind of dialogue you're talking about is only possible with somebody who's willing to
Open it up.
to be just a little bit open with you. Mm-hmm. And the truth of the matter is that I'm going to tell you something that may make sense to you. Probably it will make sense to you. I left Christianity 5 years before I left fundamentalism. What I mean by that is that when I was a Christian, I was always in search of the one true and righteous way to follow Jesus. And when I left Christianity, couldn't believe it anymore, I immediately started to try to figure out what's the one, a secular person. What's the one, do we meet together in community, or is community unimportant? How shall we live? And I was trying to figure out the one right path. It took me 5 years to figure out that, wait a second, if it's all invented, there may be what? Many different ways that different people can make the most of their lives. It may be that this autistic friend that I have would fall apart in a community like this. It would just be too many people, too much chaos. And that his best life doesn't involve being part of a little community. And it may be that this other person over here, who's been deeply traumatized, they're not going to be able to have the kind of like freewheeling conversations with Christians that I have, both publicly and privately, that plant those seeds and that do those good things in people's lives, because they got hurt so bad. In the same way that like somebody who's been ripped apart by dogs as a little child, they may never get to the place where they're going to be comfortable in your home with your chihuahua. And it's really important that when we put out ideas, that we sort of bracket them a little bit. And this is a really helpful thing you've said, that we bracket them by saying, this might work for you. This might make sense for you. This might work with your family, but it might not work with your family. And some people come from backgrounds and from families that are so toxic that the best way that they can love their family is to keep a boundary and put distance between them. Because in a strange and bizarre way, even those crazy people that are going to send you to hell for playing Uno, because they play with cards, in some weird place, they think they're right, and they want what's best for you, and they think that that's best for you. And so if they really want what's best for me, instead of doing what they say, I'm going to go with their motive, and I'm going to do what's best for me. And sometimes what's best for me is that I stay away. Mm-hmm. And so please don't take my here's how you do it as, and you should do it in all circumstances.
It might not work for everybody.
I
never could tell my mom, because by the time I was totally out, and I knew I was never going back, she was already old and sickly and on her deathbed so many times. I knew all it would do was just wreck her. She could never get her mind open. Never.
No.
So I just couldn't.
Yeah, no, I've been at many a bedside in the last few years where somebody at the end of it is sort of like, will you pray for me? And I'm like, yes, I will. Dear Jesus, take our brother Sam. And you go like, you've got to be kidding. And you go like, yeah, what do you think? I'm going to go to hell for lying? I don't believe in any of it. But I do believe in doing what's best for Sam in that moment. And in that moment, I'm with you. Thank you so much for saying that. Yeah. You don't have any more time. We have no more time. We have no more time. However, what we do have is lunch, right? Are we going to lunch?
Yes.
Where are we going to lunch?
You are good. You are good.
Because I'm going to lunch. And so, I mean, like, it's fun to answer questions in front with a microphone like you're a big, important person. But, like, if you really want to talk about any of this stuff, I'll see you at Fuddruckers and we'll just talk about it. Okay? Does that sound good?
That sounds perfect.
All right, I'm done.
Thanks, Bart. So I'm going, actually my announcements, I have more announcements than usual. Basically, around Secular Week of Action. So Secular Week of Action this year is April 29th through May 7th. What is that, you ask? Well, it's a reaction to what's called National Day of Prayer, which is a day in the first week of May. That's been around for a while. So this is a response to that. So they have National Day of Prayer, we have Secular Week of Action, and this is where we get to schedule a bunch of volunteer events and community things that help our community, and do things as secular people to show that we can also do good in this world. So we've worked really hard to give you a lot of options for that week. If you plug into Houston Oasis Meetup and actually Secular Houston Meetup and Houston Atheist Meetup, you're going to see the events that we have scheduled. So I'm going to run through them real quick. What we have at this point is April 29th, I have a volunteer shift at the Houston Food Bank, one of my favorites. April 30th, we have a blood drive right here. It's going to be in the back of the auditorium. They're going to put curtains up there, and so you get to donate blood while you're listening to the speaker in 2 weeks from today. And so, wonderful way to help your community. And on May 4th, we have 2 events at the same time, the same place. So there's going to be a voter registration table, as well as Houston Area Women's Center Kit Assembly. And both of those are going to be at Axelrad at 7 p.m. All these, again, are on the Houston Oasis Meetup. They're going to be on our Facebook page and on our email weekly updates. So, and then May 6th, we have a Project Cure volunteer shift. That's going to be a Saturday. And then May 7th, Sunday, it's going to be a cleanup of Baker Ripley out here. We're going to have some bags. We could get out here and clean up the area. They've been wonderful hosts to us over the years, and one way to help back, help them as they've helped us, and clean up some trash in the process. Of note, I'm going to call it HAWK, Houston Area Women's Center. It's an acronym. So HAWK Kit Assembly. We, Houston Oasis, are going to assemble items for 2 separate kits. One's like a toiletry kit, and one is a hospital visit kit. And there are certain items that they want in each kit, and we're going to post them. We have posted them, but we're going to post them on our Facebook page and try to make it easy for you to help us assemble these things. Either buy these items, and the clothes need to be new clothes, but we'll let you know what type of clothes they are. And the toiletries, obviously new toiletries. So if you want to buy these items yourself, do it now, because we need time to assemble these and take them with us to Axelrad on the day, which is going to be May 4th. If you want to donate money to us so that we can buy these items, do it sooner than later. We need time to go out and physically buy these things, get them, and take them to the kit assembly. So we love donations last minute, but please, please do it sooner than later, just because we need lead-up time. Another thing that needs a little bit of lead-up time is the blood donation. So that's going to be in 2 weeks from today, in the back of this right here in the building. So sign up for a time slot. Walk-ins are definitely welcome, but you may not get the time you want. So sign up now or sooner than later for the time slot. There's a QR code in the back that you can use your phone and get on a time slot. They're going to give away free T-shirts, and it's a wonderful way to help your fellow human with donating blood, which is always in dire need. It's a lot. I never talk this much. Hey, thank you all for coming. I know Bart said about community is everything. That's what hooked me into this when I kind of wandered in here in 2016 is you all, the community. So plug in on our Meetup, our Facebook page, or the website. We have free stuff in the back. Keep an eye out for the Secular Week of Action, a bunch of events. And thank you all for coming. Enjoy your day and your week.